My name's Anthony Bale and I'm a professor of medieval literature. Welcome to my exp. I've been reading the book of Margery Kempe for over 30 years, and it's a source and a text I keep on coming back to and seeing new things in it. It's the most remarkable artifact from medieval England, I think. And I first encountered it as an undergraduate a long time ago. And at this time, which was in the early 1990s, Margery Kempe was still a very marginal, forgotten voice. And her book wasn't on the university syllabus. Me and a friend of mine had to kind of lobby to spend some time studying her because she wasn't considered up there with Chaucer and Malory and Langland and the famous medieval English poets as worthy of study. Telling the story of a 15th century bourgeois woman opened an absolutely unique window onto the medieval past, onto details of everyday life, onto domesticity, onto embarrassment, onto caring for one's husband, onto food, onto these really important parts of being alive. And I've stuck with it since then. I find it's an absolutely remarkable source. The Book of Margery Kempe is often described as the first English autobiography. That's a slightly complicated term because there are earlier texts like Mandeville's Travels, which are written in the first person, even if they're not historically accurate. And Margery Kempe certainly didn't write her book herself. She couldn't physically write. She needed several scribes to write it down for her. What it is, I think it's fair to say, the earliest named story of someone's life, of a woman's life from medieval England. She wrote her book when she was an elderly woman looking back on her life, and it describes a kind of mental, spiritual and physical crisis after she had her first child, and her development from being a jealous, acquisitive merchant's wife into a mystic and into having spiritual conversations with Jesus, with God, with the Virgin Mary, with the saints, and turning herself from being what we might think of as a worldly person into a spiritual person. This takes the form in her book of great torment, great humiliation, lots of spiritual conversations with confessors and with advisors, and also a remarkable set of pilgrimages to Rome, Jerusalem, Santiago de Compostela, and through Europe and around the British Isles, which are an ordeal for her, but show her in a kind of imitation of Christ as developing her spiritual authority through being an outsider, through being mocked, through being scorned. The Book of Margery Kempe is a really important document in terms of the history of emotions because Kempe is so varied and free with describing different kinds of emotional states. On the one hand, she describes in Middle English terms what it meant to be mentally distressed, what we might now call mental illness. She describes going out of her mind with distress during her first pregnancy and in the aftermath of her giving birth to her first son. She describes in great detail this moment of distress for her, which includes her biting her own hand and leaving a scar there, which she has for the rest of her life. She also describes how this is when she has her first vision of Jesus, and she says in Middle English, she was steadied in her wits by this vision. She is given a kind of consolation which gives her emotional peace. Jesus appears and sits on the end of her bed and calms her down and then disappears again. And he appears as an incredibly good-looking man. And she repeatedly describes in the book Jesus as this very sexually attractive and physically available presence to her. She also describes her husband in sexual terms, and she describes this mortifyingly embarrassing episode where a man at her church asks her to have sex with him, and she says yes, and she goes to meet him to have sex with him, and then he says, no, I was only joking, and I was only testing you. And so very closely linked to her spiritual erotic life is also this public life of embarrassment and shame and mortification that she talks about in great detail. Perhaps her most important emotional expression is crying. She cries throughout the book. Her crying is social, it's performative, it makes an intervention with other people, and she receives what she calls the gift of tears in Jerusalem when she's in Calvary. She receives this gift from God, and her crying is uncontrollable. It's noisy, it's expansive, it annoys people, and it's her kind of signature move. And it's a way of claiming space, of claiming the conversation without using words, of articulating her whole body. And she often talks about her heart as this kind of touchstone, this focal point of emotion. Words like joy, distress, fear, pain, these appear throughout the book of Margery Kempe. So we often think about the history of emotions not as something which goes unchanged through history. Emotions are themselves historically bounded, and the book of Margery Kempe is a very useful document in understanding what emotions meant in early 15th century England. Kempe's book is, on the one hand, her own account of herself. On the other hand, it's an amazing historical document about identifiable people and places and times that I think is, really useful to us. And so it sticks with us as a very personal account of a person moving through their life. And that to me is almost unique from medieval England. And the things that Kempe includes, I still find very, very moving and very striking as a historian. For instance, she describes how her husband, in his old age, falls down the stairs and suffers a head injury, and she has to care for him. And this is unique as a medieval source in a wife talking about her husband's dementia in old age. And it's incredibly frank. She talks about how expensive it was to keep on having to clean all the linens and keep him by the fire and dry things, and how unpleasant it was for her that he became incontinent and she had to clean him up. But this is an experience of aging, of old age and of ill health and of care in marriage, which we don't see in other sources from the Middle Ages and often is very hard to talk about today. She also talks about her misgivings around this, but then reminds herself that she'd had so much sexual pleasure from his body when he was a young man that she should repay this now as part of her marital contract and as part of her debt to him in her care for him. And so also having that voice of doubt, that voice of obligation, it's really how we all feel when we're interacting in our relationships and how relationships change throughout life. So I don't want to say that Margery Kempe is a guide to how we can live today, but there are moments of honesty and moments of compromise in it, which I think really speak to us today. For me, seeing her frankness around embarrassment and her frankness around shame, which are really crucial parts of being a social human being, of being a social animal, and having that from the Middle Ages is unparalleled and very, very touching. So I think the modern reader, with the caveat of historical distance, can also think about subjectivity through the book of Margery Kempe in a way which is absolutely unique. Readers coming to Margery Kempe for the first time are often very irritated by her emotionality, her emotional expression. They say there's too much emotion, it's put on, it's embarrassing, it's over the top. But I think we ought to remind ourselves that all emotions are historically determined, and the language we take to describe our emotions is of our own historical moment. And so when we use very common emotional language today, an example, we might say, I'm dying to go shopping, I'm dying to go to that concert, or we might use a superlative of an emotion. In historical terms, that might be unprecedented, that people are actually very, very careful about the rhetoric and the language of emotions that they use in their historical moment. And Kempe's emotional lexicon is very precise. She uses particular words, like joy, to describe a particular moment of spiritual union, not just happiness. She uses tears in strategic ways, but also in expressive ways. And so I would remind readers of the book of Margery Kempe, and I'd remind people thinking about their own emotions and emotions in the past, that our emotions are not natural, and the way we express them are not natural. They are socially determined, they are historically determined, and the way we express emotions might look ridiculous to people thinking about us in 100 years' time.